Ladies and gentlemen, it's a big pleasure to speak to you today about the European car industry, how the European car industry can achieve a net carbon neutral mobility. And I will speak about this pathway as well as about the pathway how Fraunhofer can support the European car industry and its supplier on that way. In my presentation, I will cover mainly 4 topics. The first will be what is decarbonization and why is decarbonization the key priority in industry? Second, I will speak about the Paris Climate Agreement and what is the roadmap that the car industry achieves these climate targets set by Paris. Last but not least, I will speak about life cycle engineering as the steering tool to achieve full decarbonization. And finally, I will give you also some examples how Fraunhofer supports that way in Research Campus. So, ladies and gentlemen, first, let's speak about the question why decarbonization is not one topic, it is the key priority in car industry. First of all, let's have a look at something that happened some months before. There, maybe some of you have seen that in Tagesschau, we got the message that 6 from 9 planetary boundaries were already over-exceeded. In other words, the burden capacity of the planet Earth is already over-exceeded in 6 from 9 aspects. This means for industry that the question whether an industry is successful or will fail in the future will strongly depend also on their sustainability performance. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's have a look. What are the key priorities for sustainability? Why is sustainability a megatrend? First of all, we see that we have increased customer requirements, explicitly in the B2B sector. Second, we see that also financial markets massively push sustainability and require clear science-based KPIs to measure the sustainability performance in the car industry. Third, competition. Of course, you will have a competitive advantage if you are able to deliver also to your customers. For example, CO2 neutral or circular products. And last but not least, legislation is also supporting that way, for example, with CO2 pricing or the taxonomy in the European Union. Let's have now a look what are the key sustainability areas in the car industry. We have exactly 4 key priorities. The first is decarbonization. The second is circularity. The third one are resilient and sustainable supply chains. And the fourth one is, of course, also the change of business models to offer also mobility as a service combined with digital offers. But ladies and gentlemen, today we speak about decarbonization as the key priority. Why is that the case? I just take you now on a nice journey. More than 100 years before, we now jump to the year 1850. And I will show you the development of the mean temperature on planet Earth, how this temperature developed over the last more than 100 years. What you see right here is the temperature over the month from January to December. And you see, yes, there is a light temperature increase, but it happens not so much. What's interesting is if you focus now on the year 1980, because in 1980 you see a very strong increase in temperature combined with a very strong increase of economy worldwide. And that's the reason why the situation also for you is so challenging, because not only temperature is growing and increasing, the velocity of the temperature increase is so massive that this exactly puts industry and all deciders under enormous pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have a look at the global carbon footprint over all industries. We see that currently we have 55 gigatons CO2 emitted worldwide every year. And amongst this entire carbon emissions, 15% are belonging to transport industry, 15%. So based on that slide, you could say, hey, car industry is not number 1, it's not number 2, it's not number 3, it's number 4. Yes. Why everybody talks about transport? Why politics focuses on transport? The reason is very easy. Because the other sectors, like energy, like agriculture, like industry, they have already decreased their emissions on an absolute level, while transport is still increasing. In other words, transport hasn't done its homework. And now let's finally speak about also competition. Why is it good if you have a good sustainability performance as industry? Where are the competitive advantages for you? The answer on this question is shown on that slide. Left-hand side, you see the impact of regulation and frameworks. Here you see that legislators are forcing industry for a clear science-based reporting, for example, a reporting of carbon footprints. This reporting on carbon footprints directly goes into the so-called ESG ratings. We call them sustainability ratings, and ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. And these ESG ratings then also have an impact on the price of your shares and therefore the market capitalization. So in other words, good sustainability ranking directly affects your market capitalization. Now we go to the right side of the slide. And now it really gets interesting because here we speak about the finance market. Every company, every year needs fresh money. And if we look where does that fresh money comes from, we see, for example, the big institutions like BlackRock or Hermes. These are the institutions that are refinancing industry. And the management of these assets is now under ESG management. In other words, and very easy telling, the interest rate you are paying for fresh money depends also on your sustainability performance. And therefore, sustainability performance has not only an impact on market capitalization, but also on the cost of capital. Therefore, if you perform on these two sides, you definitely have a good competitive advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's go to another point. Now let's go, what does a roadmap to Paris means? What does net carbon neutral mobility means? First of all, we have to speak about decarbonization along the entire life cycle. If we speak about decarbonization, we always have to take into account the entire value chain. We call it Scope 1 till Scope 3. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are those emissions which can be directly affected and steered by the company. Direct emissions at the production side or emissions coming from purchased electricity or heat. Scope 3 in the upstream or downstream path are, for example, coming from the supply chain or from the product use at the customer. And of course, can be managed only indirectly. But what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is decarbonization without Scope 3 is no decarbonization. You see here that, for example, for the transport sector, only 2% are belonging to Scope 1 and to Scope 2. 2%. The music plays in Scope 3, 98%. Therefore, if a company says, I have carbon neutral production sites, that's nice. But it means I have carbon neutrality on a share of 2%. And I don't speak about the other 98%. Therefore, it is of utmost importance to decarbonize also Scope 3. Second, how does a Paris Climate Agreement works? What you see here is the framework from the so-called Science-Based Target Initiative, and it works easily. First, you set a baseline. then you are setting for your company a long-term net carbon neutral target. For example, the year 2050, 2040. And you set additional to that an ambitious midterm target. For example, for the year 2030. The rules are as follows. To achieve the midterm target, CO2 reduction only can be accounted, so no offsetting is allowed. For the long-term target, you are allowed to use also offsetting in the accounting. And we have a clear priority. First, we avoid CO2. Second, we go for substitution, which means we go to renewable energy or we go to low carbon materials. And if we have that roadmap, then we are on a track to Paris. And now we look what happens in the industry, what happens on your desks, what happens at car industry. And we see that most OEMs have already committed to a life cycle-based targets. And most of them are also approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. As you see on that slide, of course, the ambition levels of different OEMs are different, as well as the net zero targets for the respective years, but the take-home message is car industry is underway. Car industry is decarbonizing the entire life cycle. And this leads us now to the question, what is the roadmap? How to achieve that net carbon neutrality? And this is now shown in the next part where I will speak about life cycle engineering. First, what is life cycle engineering? Life cycle engineering starts always with a so-called life cycle assessment, where we analyze and assess the carbon dioxide emissions over the entire life cycle. And in life cycle engineering, we derive then precise technical measures to achieve a specific set target. So, what must be done, for example, to achieve a 1.5 degree target within a specific company? If we look where does car industry stands today, we see on the left-hand side of the slide the carbon footprint of a classical car, a car with an internal combustion engine. What we see, 15% of the CO2 emissions until maybe 20% are coming from the supply chain. 2% are coming from the production. This is scope 1 and scope 2, you remember. Another 10% is coming from the fuel production, so from crude oil extraction until the filling station. And the majority, of course, comes from the tailpipe emissions. And another rest is allocated to end of life and other small measures. Let's have now a look how car industry is decarbonizing. First of all, we change the portfolio. So this means we go from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And what you see here is that on an overall basis, yes, we see the overall carbon footprint of an electric vehicle is slightly better than a comparable car with a combustion engine. So the direction is right, but the ambition level is not ambitious enough. Why? Because we shift on the one side carbon emissions in the supply chain. That's battery. As a rule of thumb, the carbon emissions in the supply chain nearly doubles compared to a normal conventional car. And we see, of course, also CO2 emissions in the electricity grid mix for charging the car. Therefore, the second measure is also to go for renewable charging, so for electricity which has no CO2 emissions. And what we see then, that there is still remaining a huge amount of carbon emissions in the supply chain and the production. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where I want now to speak about how we decarbonize the supply chain and the production. We can do that with measures for the main commodities: steel, aluminum, batteries, and of course polymers. What is the success factor to achieve these targets? Of course, one of the success factors is a very strong cooperation, a B2B cooperation along the entire life cycle, along the value chain. We need also comparable carbon footprints that can and allow us to compare the carbon performance of different suppliers. And last but not least, we need a clear indicator in the supply chain, which is euro per ton CO2 avoided. And if we have that set together, that set of scientific-based measurable KPIs, we can also steer that strategy. Let's have a deeper look into the production and the supply chain. Here, for example, shown on the example of an electric vehicle from Volkswagen. Here you see music plays number 1, battery, number 2, body in white. If you manage these two things, battery and body in white, you are managing more or roughly 50% of the carbon emissions in the supply chain. Other aspects like electronics, tires, etc. are of course also important, but first focus is on battery and body in white. Now let's go to the question how Fraunhofer supports also these development of new technologies and these research aspects. First of all, on a holistic decarbonization strategy. Of course, if I want to decarbonize my car, my vehicle, I have 4 main aspects. The first of all are circular products. Can we use closed-loop polymers, closed-loop metals? Second one is to substitute and to go for low-carbon commodities, such as green steel, green aluminum, green polymers, and others. Third is battery. Also here we need low-carbon raw materials for the batteries, low-carbon cobalt, nickel, manganese, and others. And last but not least, there will be remaining carbon emissions. There will be some. And for these emissions, we need also offsetting technologies like carbon capture and use and carbon capture and storage. How I steer now that decarbonization strategy? Of course, I steer it with a clear decarbonization roadmap and a clear cost reduction curve. We call them CO2 abatement costs. And on that slide, you see an example how I can steer in a company these decarbonization measures. You see, from a holistic point of view, there are measures which are business cases, which means there is a negative euro value for the CO2 avoided. In other words, you get money. That's cool. Of course, this is done. But it's not enough. And then we go to the next measures, which are cost intensive, and we sort them, of course, by increasing carbon costs. And then, with that roadmap, we can precisely choose the most cost-efficient measures to achieve a specific decarbonization target in the company. This is exactly where Fraunhofer also jumps in and supports you, the car industry, as well as the supply chain with innovative technologies and developments of tools which are life cycle based to steer exactly these strategies. Last but not least, a precise example. And this is a new research campus from Fraunhofer, the Campus for Circular Economy in Mobility. Here we show you how we can decarbonize cars and components of cars via developing new technologies, via measuring, for example, recycling rate, carbon footprint, and other central strategic KPIs to bring that together in the development of new parts and products for a sustainable mobility. Ladies and gentlemen, I sum up. First of all, I think I have shown you that decarbonization is the key priority in car industry. And a good decarbonization performance supports you also in the area of financial markets in terms of market share, cost of capital, and sustainability ratings. Second, Decarbonization targets are science-based and must cover always all scopes, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And Fraunhofer offers also you on a new research campus, the CCEM campus, to develop new decarbonization technologies and optimize decarbonization costs. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.